Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar here on internal audits today. Um, for those of you who came and listened to our previous webinar that we did a couple months ago, we focused on validation and verification. This internal audit webinar is going to have some connection to that. If you remember from that webinar, we talked about verification. Whether or not you were there or not, verification is the method by which we have recorded information to prove that things either are going correctly or not. An internal audit is the master version of verification. So we're going to focus on what an internal audit is, how to do it correctly, my favorite discussion, how to do it wrong, where errors come up in internal audits. We really are going to focus. I would like to try to make sure as we talk about the requirements of internal audits that we also leave time to make it very personal. How do we do it correctly? What's the feeling supposed to be in an internal audit? How do we need to behave? How are we going to be friendly with the people we're internal auditing? Are we going to be adversarial? How long should these things take? Do we need to be high stress? Things of that nature. As we get into these things, I do want to quickly point out that we do have some handouts that go along with this presentation. The handouts are a checklist, a prep list for your internal audit, and then we also have a very basic template that you could use to build your own internal audit if you wanted to do that. I should say quickly, for those of you who don't know, my name is Brian Kellerman. I am the Chief Quality and Safety Officer here at Kellerman Consulting. We are a food safety consulting firm. We also do quality management systems as well. We do a tremendous number of internal audits as part of our projects. Almost every project we have at this point, if it's a certification project, we will have an internal audit component of it. So I have a lot to share with you on that. Please do check out those handouts. Also, we've created a video series that lives on our website, which is www.kellermanconsulting.com. And one of those series is specific to internal audits. It's going to get into a little more detail about the technical specifics, whereas we're going to be dealing with, again, some more of the big picture issues. The one thing that I would like to say as we jump into these things is that my favorite part of doing webinars is getting to interact with the audience. Obviously, it's difficult for people to get up and speak in front of the microphone, but there is a chat function to the right, and I see several people are utilizing that. You can stop me anytime. I will happily discuss any questions or concerns, things that you would like to raise specifically about internal audits. It's my favorite part of these. I love doing that. It's completely fine to stop what we're doing here and address any of those questions. So as you're listening to what I'm saying, please type something into the chat. If I see it, I will try to address it immediately. So with all that said, what are we going to talk about with internal audits here? So today, as part of this, we're going to see internal audits two different ways. We're going to see it from the perspective of how do we do an internal audit. I want to make sure that we cover those basic things for those of you who are worried, how do I do an internal audit? But beyond that, we want to talk about bigger picture issues here. Like, do I even need to do an internal audit? If I'm going to do an internal audit, how do I get it started correctly? And then on top of that, like what is good about internal audits? What's the most important pieces of it? And I will say that our clients generally, most folks don't quite understand what an internal audit is for, other than I have to do it. I've been told I need to. So we want to talk about some of the benefits there. So as we look at what the, our internal audits required in the facility, we're going to look at the source of a requirement for internal audit. Why might you have to do one? And if I have to do it, what am I doing from, like, what am I doing as part of the internal audit? What am I looking for? Quickly, I do want to say that the benefits of an internal audit, if you have to do it or you don't, it, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is a master verification action, which means I'm going to see all of the record keeping I've kept for my facility. I'm going to do a spot review. So I'm going to be able to actually see if my records are there, if we can actually easily get to them, and if they've been filled out properly. I in doing that, should be able to see if my coworkers are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. If they're doing a good job, it should show up in the records that I'm looking for or that I'm looking at. And then, and most importantly here, when it comes to audit preparation, if you have to do a GMP audit or a CGMP audit or GFSI audit or ISO 9001, any of those audits, if you've done your own audit and you have found something during that internal audit, even if that problem is still there during your audit, if an auditor sees that you have properly done an internal audit and found an issue, believe it or not, you get credit for that. And so anytime that you do a good and thorough internal audit, there's extra credit for that. We'll touch on that again in a little bit. Lastly, we're going to talk quickly about supplier audits if we have some time at the end. And I just want to distinguish between doing an internal audit of my facility and then taking that show on the road and actually going to a supplier's facility or a stakeholder that may have responsibility to us, and what an audit there would look like, a second party audit. So diving in a little more with a little more detail into the requirements for an internal audit. As I just mentioned, we have to choose our standard for an audit. So for those of you who have either done an internal audit maybe once or have never done it, you need to select something that you are auditing against. That is a rule book of some kind, a list of questions. If you are thinking about doing an internal audit, but you don't know how you're going to do the internal audit, that's an enormous problem. And it should be obvious to you what you are auditing against. In our next slide, we're going to delve into like where those sources would be. But the long and short of it is, if I'm doing an internal audit, it needs to be against a proper program, which means I should have some kind of rule book or something that I am auditing against. If I go in and I just am saying, well, I don't know what I'm looking for here, but start showing me stuff, you're going to have a mess of an audit, and it's going to be almost impossible to really get a functioning one done. To go along with that, we need to have enough time for the audit. This is an issue I brought up in the webinar series that we did in the past, but I want to reiterate here, if you don't have enough time to do an internal audit and you try to rush through it or it is incomplete, those audits are probably not going to be helpful in the way that you really need them to be. And then lastly, we actually have to write down what we did in that audit. With these three things, that's pretty much it. Rule book, enough time, documentation. Well, that's pretty easy. That's not very descriptive as to like what actually makes an internal audit work and what makes it correct. So I do want here to talk quickly about my failures when I was a QA manager in understanding what an internal audit was, maybe help provide context for you folks to see if this isn't something that you're maybe struggling with now. And as I've become a consultant, now I've been a consultant for a little over 7 years, and I've probably participated in somewhere in the 40 to 50 internal audits, maybe more than that. Our company has done probably hundreds of internal audits. So now that I've been a consultant and I've done them so many times, we can talk about sort of the, as I mentioned, like how should we behave in an internal audit? When we think about setting up an internal audit and we think about it against like going around and looking at what's going on in our facility, I want to talk about when I was a QA manager, I started with a program that I had inherited, as many of us do. And in that program I inherited, I did walkthroughs every day of my facility. So I would stop what I was doing. I would come in, and each day, if I was really on my game, I would try to do 3 walkthroughs of the facility. It was about a 35,000 square foot facility. So a walkthrough may have taken 15, 20 minutes. If I could get 3 of them done throughout the day, that was awesome. And those walkthroughs had a checklist. I would check off that what I looked at and whether it was good or not. Well, when it came to internal auditing, and this was inside of a BRCGS program, I really didn't have anything to show the auditor, and it was only because that auditor was very, very nice and kind that they didn't really punish me as much as I would probably have expected knowing what I know now. I didn't have an internal audit in which I stopped what I was doing each year and went through my entire program against the BRCGS code. I tried to present my checklists and say, hey, well, I've have 150 walkthrough checklists and you can look through those. That is not an internal audit. A GMP inspection, when you go around and look at the facility and see if it's a mess and see if people are putting their equipment away properly, or if folks are leaving water in the sink, those are not internal audits. Those are simply my assessment going through and seeing how things are. Because I didn't go through my paperwork and have an actual internal audit checklist, I really never did it right as a QA manager. And it was only when I came into being a consultant and working with lots of different people that I really figured out, like, okay, an internal audit as a scheduled event where we're going to go through documentation in order. That's crucial. Here, I've presented 4 potential sources of information. As I mentioned, is a key requirement. What am I internally auditing to? Well, the 3 options here on the left side of the screen are GFSI audits. So you have SQF, BRCGS, ISO 22000, and ISO 9001 would have almost exactly the same internal audit requirements as ISO 22000 if you were a non-food facility and doing a quality management system. In any case, each one of these books, SQF, BRCGS, ISO 22000, they require audits every year. So at least every year. The BRCGS book is special in that they require that you do 4 internal audit events, but that you accomplish a full internal audit at least every year. So whether you're SQF and you do 1 audit, FSSC and you do 1 audit, or if you choose within those programs to break them up, you would take the rule book and chop it into subsections and say, I'm going to go through this book in order. On the right, I have a GMP audit, which would be a modified audit that either you get from a certifying body, or if you wanted to develop your own internal audit, it would be something that you could do to a GMP audit standard. Designing your own internal audit is a very difficult thing to do because knowing what standard you're trying to hit can be vague. For folks in America, if you wanted to audit against the FSMA regulations, 21 CFR 117, if you're an FDA facility, if you wanted to internally audit against 9 CFR 417, if you're a meat and poultry HACCP, or if you wanted to do a internal audit against seafood HACCP and do 21 CFR 123, those are things you could do. And I believe you could probably download the regulations for those and you could audit against that, but there should be a book and you should be auditing against that book. So if we are thinking about, okay, I have a QA manager who is going to officiate an audit. I have operators or QA techs that are going to be presenting information. And we have decided the book we're going to audit against. I have let's say a CGMP audit for dietary supplements in a dietary supplement facility. So I'm going to internally audit against a checklist for that. And I, as the auditor, I'm on one side of the room and I have the people who I'm going to be auditing against, and we've got lots of time. We have plenty of time here. We're going to schedule a full day, maybe 2 days if we need to, and we're going to start asking for information. So in an internal audit, we are asking for information in order. There should be questions that, again, for an SQF code, for example, we're going to go straight through the clauses, starting with 2.1.1, going all the way down through the end of 2.8, which is allergens. And then I'm going to go over into my module, which is going to be, if I'm a food manufacturer, module 11, I'm going to go straight down those. For BRCGS, I'm going to start at section 1, and I'm going to go all the way through section 7 or possibly section 8 if I'm a high-risk facility. But I want to go in order, and I want to ask each clause question, and I'm going to ask the person presenting me information to show me their information. So, for example, when we get to a recall plan, the requirements in any program are that a recall plan is there. So when I get to that question, I'm going to ask, please show me your recall plan. What I'm looking for as an internal auditor is that the person I'm auditing knows what a recall plan is, that they can actually start to pull it out, and then we can go through and actually look at the recall plan itself. If somebody, when you sit down to do an internal audit for the first time or with someone who has not done it before, oftentimes the oh my goodness moment where, oh, I have to go find this thing. Oh, shoot, I didn't have it ready. That's the most important learning experience you can have initially in an internal audit, which is recognizing, oh, I have to go get information and I have to bring it back here, and we're going to need to do that quickly. When you have a demonstration from the person being audited, which in an internal audit is our facility, that we know where documentation is and we can find it, that is crucial. Okay, once we have that, once we've established, oh, I need to go pull information out, we start to work backwards from that and think, well, where am I going to put my information for an internal audit? And the right answer should be, it should be in the room already. But if we've never done an internal audit, just even thinking through, I don't want to have to get up and walk to a different room or go back to my computer to pull up information. So when we're thinking about an internal audit and prepping for it, and prepping for an internal audit may be something that you do in years 2 or 3 of the internal audit. But when we think about, again, having a rule book that we're going to audit to, we should know all the questions ahead of time. And we should at least, if nothing else, get our documents ready so that we can quickly access that information. As we look at filling out this internal audit report, what this slide is about, it has the very basics that you need to when we go through question by question. And much like the audit itself, where we need just basically a rule book, enough time, and we need to have a written record for it, our record itself is quite simple. We have our rule book questions for the internal audit. What are we auditing against? We have our questions on the left side here. We do have to have an assessment of conformance. And conformance here means, is it right? So when I ask a question, the answer better be either, yes, I have the correct stuff and I looked at these records and they are filled out correctly, or there's something wrong here. Something wrong, a non-conformance in an audit is either I cannot find the information or the information is not accurate. And within that, it could be I didn't fill out a form right, or filled it out with the wrong information, or the form I was filling out has the right information, but it was actually an old version of the form. Non-conformance can be anything in which we are looking line by line through what we're auditing and we find things that are not correct. So as we evaluate conformance and non-conformance, that second column there, we have to have evidence. Now, evidence, and this is something that I, even today, even with all the audits I do, I still sometimes get, if I'm going quickly, forget to write down the evidence for both conforms and does not conform. When I'm being sloppy and forget, I will oftentimes just write the word conforms or put yes and then leave the evidence blank. And I am very good at documenting the evidence of non-conformances when things are wrong. What is wrong and how did I fix it? But in a proper internal audit, we actually write down both evidence for conformance and evidence of non-conformance. For those GFSI audits, that is a requirement. It is absolutely best practice always in an internal audit to do that, because you as the internal auditor may know, oh, I know that this is right because I've seen that recall plan before. But in an audit, when you are internally auditing a recall plan, you should write down the name of that document as the evidence of what you looked at for we do have a recall plan. Or for your sanitation program, these are the cleaning records I looked at. These are the ATP swab records I looked at. These are the preoperative inspection logs that I looked at. So evidence would just be naming documents if you have conformity. Or you can say, I watched someone do an act on the floor as part of this. So evidence can be very, very brief and basic. Where we find a non-conformance, in this 113, I have a no for conformance. So I actually have an error. I have the date and person completing CA, which is corrective action here. And I need to have that corrective action. What did I do when I found something wrong? And then I also usually will have some kind of observation that goes along with that, which is a little background information to either explain, follow-up actions or indicate what we're going to make sure happens after we do this corrective action. Now, I don't have the date here on this, so you can already, when we internally audit this document, you can see that in column 4, date and person completing. I didn't put a date yet, so oops. So here I have something that is not quite right. I would put in here maybe September 1st if it was going to be something to be finalized, or I could have said I did it last week on August 18th. Okay, I do want to state here when it comes to a corrective action and finding things wrong. The step back here, this big picture with an internal audit, and this is where I really want to talk about the personalizing an internal audit. Audits do not need to be super friendly. They don't need to be, you don't have to have conflict. You don't have to be sort of adversarial. The act of sitting down with a rule book and just starting at the top and saying, show me this first document, show me your policy statement, now show me your org chart, now show me the objectives for the facility and job titles, things like that. As you go through, Kaima, I see your question. I'm going to finish the sentence and I'm going to answer your question immediately. Okay, so as we go through and we, as we are thinking big picture as to like what approach we need to take in this audit, as you go through and ask those questions in order, what we're going to discover quickly are errors. You're going to find a lot of them. And those may be signatures that were not correct. We didn't fill out a form right. This document is not up to date. The act of doing the internal audit should, at some basic level, sort of complete itself. So if we do the internal audit, again, with the right people, with enough time, with a written record, it should not be difficult at all. The errors and the issues that are going to come up should be jumping off of the documents you're reading, and you should easily be able to find some of these errors. Do I need to have 100 errors in internal audit? Absolutely not. We need to find a couple at a minimum, and we're going to talk about non-conformances and how they're reported later in this discussion. But the long and short of it is, when we do an internal audit, the errors, the problems, the catches that we need to find, they should just come right out at us. So Kai Ma asks, what are the best practices or recommended systems for documentation? So what are the best systems for documentation? Well, for an SQF audit or a BRCGS audit or the ISO 22000, the FSSC, usually we have checklists. You can download an SQF checklist and you can get a BRCGS checklist free. If you're going to get a GMP audit from a certifying body, they send you the audit ahead of time. If you're going to have a supplier that asks, if you're going to get a second party audit and somebody says, all right, well, I'm going to come and audit your facility and I want to do an internal audit ahead of time, I need to use their rule book that they give me. So the systems of documentation, theoretically, you should have an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, something you can type into or write into, and it needs to be those questions in order. As far as the system itself, we'll get into at the very end here. I do have a quick statement on software. If you have software that you can enter information into, great. But either way, the system for documentation should be one checklist that has at least these questions that you see here on this slide. I need to know what the standard was, so what questions I'm asking, whether there is conformance or non-conformance, what is the evidence, do I have a corrective action and a date for that corrective action, and is there anything else I need to provide as subsequent documentation. If it's legible as a best practice, if they are comprehensive enough so that you can go back or people in the facility can go back and see what your internal audit was and it was very clear to them, then your documentation was correct. I guess, Kai, what we're going to look at next is non-conformances and reporting to senior management. And I do, instead of failing to answer your question, I want to say what we do with the information after it's done is probably as important with choosing a specific internal audit documentation system. Because like I say, if it's written down, it's a record, and we should be in good shape on that. So let's look at these non-conformances and corrective actions. When I do an internal audit, now this is both to the standards of GFSI, the highest standards, and really just best practice in our facility here. Finding something wrong and writing it down and following it up is hugely important in an internal audit. One of the benefits of the audit is I get to find it myself, and I'm less concerned or worried that an outsider is going to come in and find that, whether it be a government inspector or a certification auditor. Beyond that, these non-conformances, the thing that to the highest levels of internal audit, the expectation is that you're going to present these non-conformances of your internal audit to management and to supervisors where you found them. And so when I write down my non-conformance, to go back to Kai's question here about best practices, I better have my list of non-conformances. Your best practice is that those non-conformances should probably be moved from your internal audit checklist to a separate list so that I can hand that list of non-conformances out to people so that we can go back over them, because when I found it wrong in my internal audit, I need to have some kind of reminder weeks later to go back and see if when we identify it in the internal audit that we actually fixed it and that it stayed fixed for the next time. And if my internal audit happens once a year, then waiting 12 more months to go back and internal audit it to see if it actually stuck, that's not great. So my non-conformance list from an internal audit is a clear sign that I've done a good internal audit, especially if there's a bunch of non-conformances on there. It doesn't mean we need to nitpick, and it doesn't mean we want to make people feel bad. If you're doing an internal audit, that is you auditing your facility, or if you have an internal auditor from a corporate structure that comes in, even if it's a separate division of a larger corporation and it comes into your facility to internal audit, it shouldn't be necessarily adversarial. I would hate to hear, and I do hate to hear from folks that they had internal audits that made them feel bad. An internal audit is us checking ourselves. So it should be a supportive and positive thing, not a punishing thing. And so when we have non-conformances, those are really all of the non-conformances we find are not things to be angry about, but things to celebrate as part of an internal audit, because we found it. We actually did our audit and started looking. And when we looked, we are definitely going to find stuff. So I know if I'm going to sit down with a client or some company and say, hey, show me your internal audit, if they have a 15-page checklist and it's got a bunch of writing on it and they found a bunch of things wrong, I know they actually spent the time to do it, which is wonderful. So when I have these non-conformances, as we mentioned, I'm going to go back a slide real quick. We have our date and person completing the corrective action as part of that non-conformance. And now we're going to make sure that we follow up on those non-conformances and that they are listed properly in the documentation and then reported later on to management. Now, this is not a webinar about senior management review, that we may do one about those later. But when I think about a senior management meeting, whether it's a weekly production meeting, whether it's a monthly safety meeting, whether it's an annual senior management review meeting, one of the most important parts of an internal audit is that it is reported at those meetings. So when I do an internal audit, if I'm finished, I should go to the next meeting, let everyone know that the audit occurred, what we internally audited within the facility, and then what we found wrong and how we fixed it. If all of that is done, you are really getting into the absolute best practices for an internal audit to let everybody know what was important about it and to let everyone know that we are following up and we are going to be watching those specific issues. In the fancier programs that we do, BRCGS is probably has the most requirements for internal audit, in that the book tells you how to do it, and there's a lot of things you have to keep track of. One of the main documents that goes with the internal audit is an internal audit risk assessment, in which you define the riskiness inside your facility and you audit the audit frequency. And again, in a BRCGS audit, you have to audit 4 times. in a year, but you only have to audit the whole program once, but you may actually audit different parts of your program multiple times in a year. So I may do 4 audits, cover, my shipping receiving may only get internally audited once, but my sanitation program may get audited 2 times. Or I may say, I have so many problems in my sanitation program, I'm actually going to internal audit all 4 times, and then I'll just actually add other parts of the facility to go along with that. That would be really, really sophisticated approaches to internal audits. So thinking about in your factory finding, whether it be your factory, even if it's an administrative office, if you're a broker or an agent and you want to do internal auditing, it's the same thing for those facilities as it would be in a factory, albeit with different documents. But when I think through my organization and I have a basic sense of things that work better or work worse in my facility, I should be targeting in a sophisticated way those areas that I see issues. Now, to go all the way back to my statement about how I used to just do internal walkthroughs every day and multiple times a day, hey, listen, even though I was not functionally doing an internal audit correctly, nobody knew my factory as good as I did because I was back there all the time. So when it came to looking through documentation and seeing how things were going, the spirit of being on top of my facility and going out there and keeping eyes on it, doing those verification actions, that was there. What I was failing to do was going through the documentation set and saying, I'm going to look through my production records and I'm going to actually look at signatures, look at dates, things like that. And doing it in a concerted internal audit. So when we are thinking about, again, looking at non-conformances and corrective actions, where I may internal audit and find an error in the same program multiple times, same part of my program multiple times, I should be elevating that. That is a driver in how I change my internal audit approach, what I'm targeting, and it'll probably lead to, again, if I have to do corrective actions because I'm finding mistakes, I should be changing that program, albeit in small ways, to get better outcomes for the next time I internal audit, and then also hopefully better results day to day in my operation. To just quickly go along with that, and as I mentioned, if an auditor sees that you've internally audited a part of the facility and you noted a non-conformance and it stays a non-conformance in a government inspection or a certification audit, the fact that you found it and the fact that it is written down as one of these non-conformances, yeah, it ain't great that you don't have your corrective action done yet. And it might not be a great look that like I found something wrong and I didn't jump on fixing it. If it was a critical control point issue, if I was not cooking chicken to the proper temperature and I did nothing, that would be catastrophic. But if I am looking through a food defense plan and in my internal audit, I have a food defense plan. It is up to date. It is signed by the right people. It has the right food defense team on it. I go through the defense measures, the security measures in that document are correct for my facility. But oops, we did not do a challenge to my food defense system as of my internal audit. And I write that down and my corrective action is to schedule it. And it falls through the cracks. And I do an internal audit 2 months later, or I'm sorry, an internal audit. If I have a proper audit or a government inspection, and the inspector also discovers that I have not done the required challenge to my food defense plan, but I did notice it in an internal audit, the auditor is at least going to feel good about the fact that we are actually looking carefully and checking. And so again, you get some credit for that, even if there is a little bit of a delay or a sloppiness in closing all this out. So again, by sitting there and doing the internal audit, by diligently asking the questions, finding things that need to be observed and writing them down, it is crucial to protecting us from having outsiders come in and ask us about these same issues. So to quickly add back into this management commitment process. Okay, so let's just take a couple of baby steps backwards here. the people on this call, most likely, I recognize some of you as clients, as former clients, as folks in the QA industry or have that profession. So, which is what makes sense. A QA manager is going to be the person ultimately probably responsible for doing an internal audit. But that means the quality assurance department is on board with this. When it comes to properly doing it in a facility, having senior management supporting this process means that the senior management at the facility is asking when the internal audit is going to be done. They are providing enough time and recognizing that you as the QA manager and the people you're going to be internal auditing need to have the time to set up the audit and do it properly, which means that we may need to lessen production for some part of 1 or more days, or at least recognizing in slow periods, this is something that needs to be elevated as a matter of importance. Senior management should be asking about internal audits. And as we mentioned in senior management review, they should be asking for the results of the internal audit and specifically the non-conformances that have come up. So if you are thinking about your facility and your business, if your boss, if the EVP or the owner of the business or the president has not asked you ever about an internal audit, they're not doing their job. They should be asking about it. If you've never presented non-conformances of an internal audit, if you have a requirement to do an internal audit, I should clarify that. If you have the requirement to do an internal audit, but you've never presented non-conformances to anybody and no one's asking you about it, we have a problem. And whether you as the person who does the internal audit needs to do an end around and let everyone know you should be asking about my non-conformances from this, or if you just never thought about it because it's never come up, if you are not presenting the non-conformances, that there is something missing here. And if you're not reporting it to senior management, then that means that senior management is failing on their part of it. And again, this is for people who have to do internal audits. If your facility chooses to do internal audits, if you have some kind of rule book that you've come up with or that a sister facility has provided to you or it's part of your corporate structure, but there is no policy statement or a procedure that says you have to internal audit every year, then whether you choose to present to senior management, whether you choose to present the non-conformances might be up to you in that facility. But I would say if you are going to do an internal audit, the presentation to senior management, the presentation to senior management and operations of the non-conformances is a sign that I've actually done the internal audit correctly and I took it all the way to the end. Does anybody have any questions as we go? Now is, again, a great time. If any come up, please do type them in. I'm happy to answer any questions with any time we have left. So I did want to talk here about supplier audits. So when we talk about internal auditing and we talk about selecting our book and we talk about, again, whether it's a GFSI book, GMP, or supplier expectation that we're going to internally audit against. We also, as part of almost all food safety programs, or really quality management systems, it is frequent that we will set supplier audits as a requirement for those suppliers or vendors who we designate as high risk. To quickly review what that would mean, I always tell my clients, if you have a high-risk supplier, that means those people sell you stuff and you do not trust them at all. The things that they sell you, you basically cannot accept the materials in the building at face value, that we have reason to believe there are problems. They've sent you the wrong stuff over and over again. They never seem to send the right amounts that you've agreed to. They're late on getting you crucial documents. You feel like maybe they're pulling a fast one on you, scamming you or committing fraud. But we have to use that supplier because they're the only ones that can get us this material. That would be a circumstance in which we have high-risk suppliers. Those suppliers probably should get a visit from you. If we don't trust a supplier, if we don't trust a vendor, we should probably visit them. Maybe we're incorrect. Maybe we can trust them, but there's just a communication gap or something like that. And if I go to their facility and I see they're doing a great job, great. Doing a supplier audit is a best practice as part of a supply chain program and as part of due diligence on controls for the stuff coming into our facility. A supplier audit is roughly an internal audit. You would do it the same way in the sense of, as a QA manager, I would sit down with a secondary party, my supplier, and still go through the same way that I would do an internal audit. And that is why I think it's so important to talk about this within the context of an internal audit. To quickly bring it back in, my internal audit and my supplier audit would be functionally the same thing, except in my internal audit, I should be able to access all the information in my facility. There should be no documents that are locked away and inaccessible to me. It is possible there are HR issues, HIPAA related documentation that might not be appropriate for businesses to share even internally. But short of that, if I'm looking for my production records, if I'm looking for bills of lading, sales documents, inventory control documents, all of that should be available to me. When I go to someone else's facility to perform this type of audit, they may say to me, I don't have to show you this information, and I'm not going to. So you do have some limitations as to what can be asked for in a supplier audit. With that said, the same basic principles apply. I need to have enough time. I need to have the right people involved. In case of a supplier audit, it's going to be the right person at that supplier or that secondary party that can answer my questions. And I need to write it down, and I need enough time to do it. Elizabeth asks, what if their standard is different than yours? You are an SQF facility, but they are BRCGS. Really great question. So for this supplier audit, you're saying, hey, I'm an SQF facility and I'm going into a BRCGS facility. Well, in this case, it should be irrelevant to this second party audit. Elizabeth, if you're an SQF facility, you must internally audit your SQF program by yourselves, right, in your facility. If I visit a BRCGS facility, they need to internally audit themselves to the BRCGS standard. If you are going to go to their facility, you do not need to ask them to account for the difference between SQF and BRC. What we need to ask is, hey, if you're BRCGS, did you do an internal audit here? And if so, show me your internal audit records. Whether SQF and BRCGS has the same rules is not our problem in a supplier audit. So we don't care. And in fact, and this really gets at you've got at a really great distinction here, because when I go visit someone else, the rule book that I'm going to use for a supplier audit is going to be something I probably make up myself, right? It can be a much smaller document where I'm looking for your food safety program, your recall plan. I need to see if you've done an internal audit. I need to see the documents you send to me, right? So I'm not even allowed to ask for some of those things in your BRC program versus my SQF program, because some of that stuff doesn't apply to my personal, the business interaction that we're having, the stuff I buy. So if I go into a supplier audit, I have to focus on these are the things that I buy from you, and I need to see the records on that. And I want to take a look through your facility and your records to make sure they are fine. So the difference in what rule books they apply to for their facilities should not enter into how I assess them. Jennifer asks, if a supplier has been deemed high risk, can they eventually, maybe after an audit, go back to medium or low risk? And what would you recommend as a time frame to change a risk level for a supplier from high to medium to low? Jennifer, that is a really wonderful question. I have to say, this is some of my favorite stuff here. So and again, I will tell you now, for our clients, I don't think I've ever rated a supplier high risk, because what I tell my clients is, if you have a high risk supplier, get a different supplier. Like, what are you doing? I mean, unless they are selling you saffron and it literally cannot be had for a reasonable price elsewhere. Like, what, you can't get sugar from somebody who's not going to rip you off? So if I have a high risk supplier, I would like to see that relationship winding down. Now, but that does not speak to how do I make them not a high risk supplier? Well, from a philosophical standpoint, when they address the issues that you have with them, then they immediately can be brought down to medium or low risk. You can have corrective actions with them that make them a medium or low risk, or they can get a new person to help you who's doing a better job at responding to you. That might make them lower risk. When it comes to a supplier audit, if I have problems, if someone has sent me incorrect product, or they're sending me incorrect documentation, like it's wrong, and I call them up and they're just like, oh, I don't care, I'm too busy. Well, guess what? Now I'm getting on a plane and I'm going to come see you. If I come see you and do a supplier audit, one, what I can tell you is the act alone of doing a supplier audit tells your supplier that you are paying close attention and that you care. You should expect to see better behavior just by doing the audit. I never make our clients do supplier audits because it's expensive to do that travel, and you're generally bringing high valuable employees off site to go perform these functions. But if it can be done, you are really going to get your supply chain tightened up. Beyond that, when I go and visit that supplier, if they're high risk, if I know my business and I go on site and I see that even if documentation problems have been there or there have been some issues, but I go into a facility and I see that they are very well run, and that's, again, doesn't mean that you need to be an incredible detective. That just means walking around and seeing that it's clean, sitting down with the QA manager and feeling through if they are being comprehensive in their answers to you, respectful, they care about what you're asking about. You absolutely have the right to lower it to a medium or a low risk. It is the fact that you wrote down, I visited this supplier, and because I visited them, I'm lowering my risk level. There isn't an inspector or an auditor in the world who is going to challenge you if you've done that. The issue, though, lastly, I'll say, Jennifer, for what you're bringing up here, is that if I don't go visit them and I decide to lower the risk level, then I'm going to be challenged. Well, how did I make that determination? Again, a different employee at the company who can meet my needs better might accomplish the same thing. But if I go and visit, that is gold standard for having a good reason to lower the risk level. Abu Bakar asks, if a supplier has got another certification, do I need to audit them? Or is the evidence of certification, can that be enough to deem them compliant? Yes, that is the purpose of GFSI and GMP audits. Theoretically, going back, and this goes back now 10, 12, 15 years, the food industry, as I understand it, the hope at the time was that GFSI audits would do exactly that. It would make it less of an issue for having to devote resources as a business to have to go on site. I will have my suppliers commit to a GFSI or GMP audit. They will have a professional come in and audit against their certification standard. And the certificate itself will confer some degree of confidence on all of us. Like, why do I have to go duplicate it? So in the context, again, of my supplier approval program, at least the way that we write them at Kellerman Consulting and the way that we advise our clients is that if someone has a GFSI certificate, theoretically, they should be low risk, unless there are other incidences specific to a company. So if somebody has an SQF audit or SQF certificate, but they sent me stuff that has metal pieces in it, and when I called and complained, they didn't do anything about it, the fact that they have an SQF certificate doesn't really give me any confidence because I see empirically that they are screwing up. Then I might have to go out and visit them anyways. But if I'm buying from a supplier and they have a certificate of a standard, whether it be GFSI or a little bit below, that means they were audited, which should mean that you don't need to necessarily duplicate that as a supplier audit unless you had a very good reason for doing that. Phoebe has mentioned in the chat a link to our supplier approval series. I'm very happy that, you get to this level of discussion and all of the things in industry sort of come together as to one big program. So the fact that we're discussing all of these things together is a really good thing. We do have links to some extra information if you want to take a look at that. So quickly, as a summary, the difference between an internal audit and a supplier audit. For my internal audit, there should be no travel restrictions. I should be able to do it whenever I want. It might just be go to the conference room and grab some folks and have them come with. The big challenge here is not auditing our own work. I didn't choose to dwell on how to not audit our own work in this webinar, only because I want you folks internally auditing. So we can worry about not doing our own work. Yes, that is absolutely the intent of an audit, is that I don't go through my own work and sign off that it was done correctly. But in almost all instances, and I hope that it can provide some semblance of comfort to each of you listening, is that in most businesses, the QA manager is stuck doing the internal audit. And the QA manager is oftentimes stuck doing the whole program. And if they don't do the internal audit, it's not going to get done. At that point, it would be best to never internally audit your own work, but under the need to do an internal audit, get that internal audit done. In year 2, if you can internally audit in teams, if you can bring someone to internally watch you do it, if you have to internally audit your own work and they can sign off that they watched you internally audit this work and that there was a verification of the verifier, that I watched the internal auditor do this, and when they had to internally audit stuff that they signed, it was done correctly. That person watching you would be the way to get around that if you split up the audit amongst different people. Lastly, for the internal audit, the non-conformances, you should easily be able to go to your senior management and say what happened, and the follow-up should be easy. If you're doing it, if you're a business that is functionally doing internal audits, but you're getting pushback from people on corrective actions, is there something weird going on in your organization? If you're well run enough to do an internal audit, theoretically, getting assistance with non-conformances, doing those follow-ups should not be that big of an issue. Well, for supplier audits, you have to price in going to your supplier unless they're down the street. I always offer up with clients that want to do supplier audits, find someone that's in your same state or in the same city. You can just practice, and it won't take necessarily a whole day or cost plane tickets. When you go on to someone else's site, you're not going to have to worry about auditing your own work, so that's no big deal. However, and many of us, if you've ever participated in an audit of another facility, you probably have found out that they may take months to even get back to you on stuff. So those non-conformances, the follow-up in my own facility from an internal audit, that should be really easy. If I've asked someone, a supplier, to change their labels, and I came to that conclusion through auditing their program, and I'm like, hey, your labels stink and I need you to have new ones, you still may wait a year. You may wait forever. They may never get around to it. And that creates a real power dynamic that can be very challenging, because if I've asked a supplier to do something and they don't do it, now, again, you're potentially creating conflict in the actual supplier relationship above and beyond any problems that may just exist because they can't send you the stuff properly. So we have a couple minutes left. I did want to quickly make one tip of the cap to software. For those of you who, if you use iAuditor or you have some program, I think there are many software applications that have built-in internal audit software. I want to say it quick because I don't consider software to be a significant part of internal auditing. There are obvious benefits to using software. I love using internal audit software and being able to upload pictures or upload evidence. If you have electronic record keeping and you can link in your intranet or within your ERP system in an internal audit function to those records, that's wonderful. And that is really helpful. So software can be a really valuable tool. It just, as we're talking about in this webinar, it is not a make or break issue. You can really keep your records on any spreadsheet or any checklist. It can be handwritten, it can be electronic. There is no judgment about that. You don't get special consideration for the use of software. It's only if you are better organized through the use of software, then it would be something very much worth investing in as part of your process. But you should not delay an audit because you don't have software. It should not be a barrier to doing an internal audit. Make sure you internal audit. If you want to go out there and select software, great. And by all means, I think there are several really good programs for that. I'm going to wind this down. One last call for questions. This is my favorite part. I get to show you the team of people I get to work with. They are truly wonderful. The best part of my job. So if you ever need anything from us, all these folks participate in internal audits, or at least bill folks for our doing internal audits for them. But one way or the other, we're all connected to internal audits. We do them regularly. We love to talk about them. I'm not seeing any extra questions coming up, so I'll give it another minute or so as I'm winding down. But in the meantime, please do make sure you remember to get those handouts. Take a look at the other videos we've done if you want to get a little more information regarding some of the ins and outs of internal auditing. I do have one more question that just popped in, Abu Bakar. In my company, we do set controls like COA that should be available by supplier delivery. However, many suppliers find this very demanding, especially because they are already certified by a local regulatory body. Are these strict demands too much to a supplier that is already certified? Absolutely not. If you ask for a COA, a certificate of analysis, is proof of safety of the stuff coming in the door. I don't care what the supplier has as far as their certification levels. I do not care how great of a company they are. You folks asking for a COA when product is shipped is not a huge demand. That is a completely normal thing to ask. And anybody who is telling you, hey, I can't be bothered with this, I already go through GFSI audit, so why do I have to send you a COA? That's a medium risk right there. Right there. Why are we even having this conversation? Like, why as a supplier are you telling me that me asking for the basic safety documentations is a problem for you? Like, Abu Bakar, sorry, I don't know if you go by a shorter name, but one way or the other, what you're asking for is reasonable, and the supplier's inability or unwillingness to work with you on very normal terms is a red flag on its own. So any supplier that's pushing back on that, I would rate them as someone to come back to and start to look at their stuff more carefully. That's not really an acceptable answer. Again, the fact that supplying a COA can be a pain in the butt, I get it. However, there is absolute, it's one thing to say, hey, I don't want to have to go internally audit, or I don't want to do a supplier audit for somebody that's already got a certification, but they should be able to send you the food safety or just safety and quality documentation that you are looking for. Okay, folks, that gets us pretty close to the hour. Got through the stuff I was hoping to talk about. As always, thank you so much for your questions. They were really, really great. I hope that you gained some sense of insight out of this. If anything else comes up, please let us know. We're always happy to do any follow-up information or discussions for anyone that has any extra questions. Thanks so much. Take care.